Hello and welcome to Introduction to the Philosophy of Religion. In this segment, we'll look at what the Shona and Akan religions tell us about our immediate fate after death. Broadly speaking, both religions envisage the spirits of the dead entering the land of the departed, or spirit world. Though before we go any further, we ought to be clear about how this should be understood. The idea that there is a physical world and a spiritual world is not entirely alien to Western thinking, and we can probably conceive of them even if some of us are skeptical of the existence of one or the other. But how we in the West think of them is likely to be very different from how Africans think of them. In the West, we operate with a very sharp physical-spiritual dichotomy, which makes us liable to think of the physical and spiritual worlds as separate and distinct. One is here, the other, in some sense, there. If the two worlds intersect or overlap at all, it's only occasionally or perhaps at their margins. A being would quite literally have to leave its world in order to travel to the other, which happens rarely, if at all. Now, many African traditional religions see things rather differently, holding that the physical world and the spiritual world fully intersect and interpenetrate. Both are, in a very real sense, here. The two worlds are continuous, not separate, and it makes little sense to speak of there being any borders between them. If there are borders, they're very porous, at least to the beings in the spiritual world, which operate in both worlds without any difficulty. As such, those in the spiritual world should be thought of as an invisible community existing within and alongside the community of the living. Consequently, for African traditional religions, the physical world we know is very much inspirited. In other words, it's infused with the spiritual. And this is clear from what we're told about the ancestral spirits, which are said to live in the soil, in the air, and in the homes of living family members. In short, they're all around us, occupying the same space we do, but not bound by the limitations of space and time in the way that we are. With all this in mind, let's now turn to the Shona religion before looking at the Akan, which will take up most of our time in this segment. Now, in traditional Shona belief, when humans die, they move from one form of life, the physical, to another one, the spiritual. This is a transition, and apparently a natural one, in the sense that it happens without any intervention from Mwari. Many will become ancestral spirits, whose role it is to protect living family members, as well as intercede with Mwari on their behalf, and punish them when they step out of line. But becoming an ancestral spirit is not automatic. For a start, not everybody qualifies to become an ancestral spirit. To qualify, one must have lived a long life, an upstanding one at that, and must have children who are still alive, and we'll discover why that should be next week. Even if someone does satisfy the requirements for joining the ancestral spirits, they still need to be brought home to the family, and that is to both the living and the dead members of the family. And this is because when a person dies, the spirit wanders around in the wilderness, and in order to be united with the family, a ritual, Kurovaguva, has to be carried out about a year after the person's death. Only once that ritual has been performed does a person's spirit join the ancestral spirits. But if that ritual is not carried out, or somebody simply doesn't qualify to become an ancestral spirit, they will become Mashavi spirits, wandering or alien spirits. So these are unattached spirits, but they may join with a particular group of ancestral spirits and assist them, for example by bestowing talents and abilities on living members of the family. And this makes them, in a way, honorary ancestral spirits. Some Mashavi spirits just wander the earth, while others may even become Ngozi, which are avenging spirits. These are the spirits of those who were badly treated in normal life or were killed. Ngozi spirits seek justice and redress for the wrongs done to them. But whether one ultimately becomes an ancestral spirit or a Shavi spirit after death, for the Shona, the transition is one way only. A person who dies will have a spiritual existence thereafter. There's no resurrection or reincarnation. So once a spirit, always a spirit. The situation with the Akan is somewhat more complicated. A number of Akan thinkers have claimed that while most people permanently pass on to the spirit world after they die, some do not, at least straight away. Those who do not are instead reincarnated, getting to live again in the physical world before dying a second time, and only then entering the spirit world. There are two different forms of reincarnation acknowledged in Akan thinking. One is relatively straightforward, the other one rather less so. But neither of the two forms of reincarnation recognized by the Akan fits with what we probably think of as the classic model of reincarnation, which you'll find in Eastern religions. In those, reincarnation is something that happens to everyone, and it happens repeatedly because we require many lives in order to perfect ourselves spiritually. This is not the Akan view. Instead, the Akan believe that there are very specific circumstances that determine when and to whom reincarnation happens. And the reasons for reincarnation have nothing to do with our spiritual development. We'll spend the rest of this segment looking at two different forms of reincarnation that can be found in Akan thinking. Let's start with the relatively straightforward one. This first form of reincarnation occurs when somebody dies young. In this case, they become a ghost and stay that way until they can be reborn to try again to work out a complete life. And here we see a clear difference between the Shona and Akan religions. In the Shona religion, as we've seen, those who die before their time become Mashavi spirits, and they stay that way. They're not reborn as flesh and blood human beings. In the Akan religion, on the other hand, those who die before their time are reborn as a way to give them a second chance at life. So why the difference between the two religions? The answer is that the Akan have a very developed notion of destiny, which underpins this first form of reincarnation. To understand the importance of destiny here, we need to start by recognizing how the Akan view human beings. In traditional Akan philosophy, a living human being has three components: the Okra, which is the soul, Sunsum, the spirit, and Honum, which is the body. We'll go into this more next week when we look more closely at the Akan idea of the afterlife. For now, we just need to know that the Okra, the soul, is like a splinter or drop of Onyami. Quite literally, a little bit of God in us. The Okra is what gives us life and also contains the message of a person's destiny, which Onyami transmits to the Okra before sending it into an unborn child. After the child has grown up, lived its life and dies, the Okra returns to Onyami. So what then is this destiny that Onyami gives each and every one of us? Well, a person's destiny determines or guides their life on earth, at least in terms of its broad strokes. A person's destiny doesn't specify all of the nitty-gritty details of their life. So it's not part of your destiny that you would be at this moment listening to a lecture podcast or reading lecture notes. Instead, your destiny will encompass your talents, characteristics, along with your eventual occupation, as well as key events like the birth of your children and so on. This destiny comes from Onyami, and it cannot be changed. But of course, some people die before it's fulfilled. And this is problematic because according to Akan thinking, destinies must ultimately be lived out. Those who died before they were able to fulfill their destiny are therefore not admissible to the spirit world, at least on a permanent basis. And in Akan thinking, they must be reborn into the physical world in order to try to complete the life they are supposed to live. Now, I've not been able to ascertain what is thought to happen in the event that things go wrong for somebody the second time around, and they end up dying young again. Quite possibly they would be reborn again. This does seem like a reasonable assumption because Akan cosmology does not seem to allow individuals to miss out on the chance to fulfill their destiny, which is why this form of reincarnation is invoked in the first place. So would this mean that all individuals will always fulfill their destiny? If not the first time around, then perhaps the second or the third? Well, again, this is unclear. Some Akan philosophers claim that through our choices, we are able to delay what we are destined to be or do. So if someone is destined to be a philosopher, but spends years trying to be a midwife, for example, they will delay the fulfillment of their destiny, though they'll still get there in the end. Quite possibly, delaying the fulfillment of our destiny is all we can do, and we're not able to thwart it altogether through our choices. For example, by choosing to live as a hermit when our destiny is really to be a nightclub bouncer. In any case, it's important to note that the point of this form of reincarnation is not so that the reincarnated can evolve morally or spiritually. That's the aim of reincarnation in some Eastern religions. And the point of this notion of reincarnation is not so that people can right their wrongs. It's only so that they can fulfill the destiny given to them by Onyami. So that then is the first form of reincarnation recognized by the Akan. The second form of reincarnation that they acknowledge is rather more controversial. In fact, there's a debate as to whether this second form of reincarnation should even count as reincarnation at all. It's complicated because it involves the spirit of a deceased ancestor returning in a new baby belonging to the same family line, while at the same time the deceased ancestor remains in the spirit world. Now, belief in this form of reincarnation is not unique to the Akan, and it can be found in other African religions, such as that of the Yoruba of Nigeria. So let's just describe the idea as the phenomenon of simultaneous reincarnation, because that captures the thought that the reincarnated person is simultaneously in the spirit world and in the physical world. Now, on the surface, the idea looks to be contradictory, because the ancestor spirit is said to be in two places at once, both in the spirit world, carrying out its duties there, while also being in the physical world, in the developing child. How can this be? Well, there's no straightforward answer, but it will help to begin by considering what the Akan thinks happens at death. Remember that a living human being consists of a soul, an okra, spirit, which is sunsum, and body, which is honum. At death, the body disintegrates, obviously, and the soul returns to Onyami, which leaves only the spirit. And the spirit is the essence of the individual and the source of its causal powers. Once separated from the soul and body, the spirit remains causally active. And this allows it to undertake the duties with which it has been tasked, such as protecting the living family members or punishing them where necessary. Now, the spirit is also said to be able to do this and return to a child in the womb, which is the phenomenon of simultaneous reincarnation that we're interested in here. Now, as I've noted, this involves a person being in two places at once, which is difficult to conceive. To avoid this and to try to make sense of the phenomenon, some philosophers have claimed that what must be happening here is that the spirit of the deceased person influences the development of a growing embryo. And this perhaps occurs through a kind of spiritual connection between the spirit of the deceased person and the spirit of the embryo. Through this influence, the developing child comes to have certain features or attributes of the deceased. And these could be physical attributes or psychological characteristics. And this in turn will lead to a detectable resemblance between the deceased and the child, which is usually acknowledged by naming the child after the deceased. While all this is going on, so the philosophers claim, the spirit of the deceased person continues to dwell in the spiritual world. It never ever leaves the spiritual world, they say, and from there it's able to influence the spirit of the developing child. So let's call this the influence theory. Okay, so this is an attempt to try and explain or understand this phenomenon of simultaneous reincarnation. So the philosophers have produced this theory, the influence theory. And it's very, very much a product of philosophical thinking. It's an attempt to give a rational explanation to a phenomenon that otherwise would strike us as really quite baffling. We'll say a little bit more about the influence theory shortly. Beforehand, let's consider the question of whether this phenomenon amounts to genuine reincarnation. The philosophers who've developed the influence theory argue that it does not. They describe the phenomenon as partial reincarnation, or apparent reincarnation, or a subtle type of reincarnation, or as a largely metaphorical understanding of reincarnation. They're reluctant to consider the phenomenon as a true form of reincarnation because they believe the spirit of the deceased merely influences a developing child. So it doesn't actually transfer into a new body at all, instead remaining permanently within the spirit world. And this is what leads them to describe the phenomenon as a partial, apparent, subtle or metaphorical kind of reincarnation. And it should be easy enough to see why. First of all, the philosophers who come up with these descriptions, they would have identified like a classic or traditional sense of reincarnation, like the soul passing from one body to another. Because after all, reincarnation literally means being put back in a body again. Then they would hold up that definition as the paradigm of what true reincarnation involves. And then finally, since they thought the phenomenon of simultaneous reincarnation differs from this, they would insist that it doesn't qualify as true reincarnation, at best amounting to a partial, apparent, subtle or metaphorical kind of reincarnation. Now, you might be sympathetic to describing the phenomenon of simultaneous reincarnation in precisely these kinds of ways. But there is another option worth thinking about. A few years ago, a philosopher called Michael Burleigh wrote a book called Rebirth and the Stream of Life, in which he tried to show that reincarnation beliefs come in many different forms. So some reincarnation beliefs take there to be a goal or direction to life, to which reincarnation contributes. but other reincarnation beliefs do not. Some reincarnation beliefs take reincarnation to be open-ended, with no definite endpoint, but again, other reincarnation beliefs do not. Some reincarnation beliefs take one's knowledge and personality traits to be carried over from one life to the next, but again, other ones do not. And some reincarnation beliefs take it that individuals are reincarnated only within one's own family, but again, others do not. And because of this vast difference among the various beliefs in reincarnation, Burley argued that we cannot suppose that there is a single classic or paradigmatic notion of reincarnation. Instead, reincarnation beliefs are heterogeneous. In other words, they are not alike, being very different in character. And because of that, Burley claimed that it makes no sense to say that one particular notion of reincarnation is the correct or paradigmatic one, and that anything differing from it doesn't qualify as true reincarnation. If you agree with Burley, then perhaps you'll be prepared to consider the phenomenon of simultaneous reincarnation as a true form of reincarnation. By way of a final thought, it's worth noting that if we are inclined to accept the influence theory as the only way to understand how the phenomenon of simultaneous reincarnation works, the problem might actually be with our own Western ways of thinking. We in the West surely take existence to be an either-or matter, such that one can exist either here, say the physical world, or there, say the spiritual world. But does it have to be this way? Well, according to one scholar, the Beng people who live in the Ivory Coast alongside the Akan conceive of existence in a different way. They take it to be dual, such that one may exist at two different levels of reality at the same time, say in the physical world and in the spiritual world. So according to this scholar, who records the view of the Beng, when someone dies, the soul is transformed into a spirit. Yet when that person is reincarnated as someone else, the spirit nevertheless continues to exist as an ancestor. The ideology posits a dual rather than an either-or existence. Unlike the classical Aristotelian framework, which demands that an identity be either one thing or another, but not both simultaneously, the Beng view allows that a being may exist simultaneously at two very different levels of reality, the one visible and earthly, the other invisible and ghostly. And possibly the Akan form of reincarnation follows precisely this way of thinking. If so, we'd be doing it an injustice to view it through a Western lens. In which case, insisting that an ancestral spirit may influence developing children, but cannot simultaneously be an ancestral spirit and a developing child, perhaps tells us more about our own ways of thinking than it does about the Akan view.